audience, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give it just about another minute as we let people join. No, it's the lunch hour for the East Coast team, so some folks may be coming back from lunch or about to start their lunch. So we're just going to give it about one more minute and then we'll get started. But thank you for being here today. Alrighty, we're actually going to go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining us. For those that don't know, my name is Tamara Fox. I am the head of consulting for Loeb Leadership, and I'm honored to be joined by Lisa Cooper from Workplace Healing. I'll let Lisa introduce herself in just a moment. But Natalie Loeb and I actually met Lisa at the SHRM conference in June in Las Vegas. And I know I instantly had a connection and desire to learn more about workplace healing just due to my own personal experiences with grief. I personally had 7 deaths in 6 years from 2016 to 2022. So when I met Lisa and spent time talking with her, learning more about workplace healing and what they do, I knew personally the value that it adds in the workplace. And I know it's work that we do with our clients at Loeb Leadership to really help workplaces be more supportive and encompassing of the whole person. So Lisa, would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience and tell them a little bit more about workplace healing, which I know we're going to talk about today in this next hour.
Thank you, Tamara. Again, I'm Lisa Cooper, the co-founder of Workplace Healing, and my co-founder and I, Mindy Corcoran, as Tamara mentioned, we're presenting at the June National SHRM Conference back in Las Vegas. And we were so delighted to meet Natalie and Tamara. And obviously no coincidences because our missions align in terms of how we work on leadership development, how we focus on training managers. And honestly, I'm just thrilled to be part of the webinar today, Tamara. So thank you so much again. Specifically, Workplace Healing was born from a personal tragedy. And Mindy Corcoran and I were doing consulting in corporate America on specifically how do you manage grievers when they come back into the workplace? And they could be grieving the loss of a loved one. They could be a caregiver grieving. Their family dog could have passed away. Anything that takes a person out of the present moment and affects productivity loss. So back in the pre-COVID days, I always say, which seems like forever ago, we were doing our consulting workshops and we were talking to supervisors and managers and leaders about basically, what do you say to someone when they come back to work after they've lost a loved one? What do you do? What should the team do? How should we support them? So with that, we created our workshops. And then in 2020, when no one wanted to do an in-person workshop anymore, we transformed our training to a 24/7 software platform. And then in February of 2022, after a significant amount of software engineering, after a significant amount of quantitative research and qualitative research to determine where are the gaps in corporate America, where are the gaps in terms of how we interact with someone when they come back to work. So we launched the Human Recovery Platform in February of 2022. And here we are a year and a half later, basically moving the needle in corporate America and leaders on how to strengthen their corporate cultures, how to interact with someone so that when they come back to work, they feel supported by their teams. And I love Tamara's personal example. I'm sad about your personal experiences, but when we shared personally about your experience, Tamara, going back to work as a griever, and working in corporate America and people being silent. I always call it the elephant in the room because no one knows what to say to a griever. And then those grievers feel alienated. So bottom line today, we're going to take the next 45, 50, 55 minutes or so, and we're going to talk to you about the prevalence of grief in the workplace. What do you do about it as a leader? How do you manage somebody? And then we're also going to look at the specific ROI of productivity loss in the workplace, because what Mindy and I have found over the last 2-3 years is that it's not a nice to have, but it's a must have in terms of productivity loss. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. And our goal today, Tamara and I are going to present a fairly informal presentation. We're both going to share as we go through the slides. But if we have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. And we'll be taking a look at chat as the presentation proceeds. So specifically, I mentioned how the productivity loss is definitely something that we've got to really focus on as leaders. And Tamara, I apologize, but right now we're not going forward with our slide. There we go, with our slide presentation. And here we are. It solved itself. So what we've done is we've created an algorithm to help leaders. Now, we can't see you all in the audience, but we've asked you to take out your phones if you could and scan that QR code. And you enter the number of employees and then your average salary. And then you'll quickly get a number of the propensity of productivity loss in the workplace due to grief. And we've based this algorithm on a significant amount of research on how much it costs to replace an employee, how much it costs to retain an employee, the absenteeism downstream effects of grief in the workplace, the downstream effects of presenteeism in the workplace. Again, when someone's there but not really there emotionally. So if you could take a minute now and download your personal grief forecast, what we'd like to do is at the end of the webinar today, get a feel for what some of the numbers might be. So Tamara, if you could tell me when we could move forward, let me know, and I'll go on forward with the slide presentation.
Yeah, we'll give our audience just a moment to look at this. And Lisa, I know when you and I were first talking about this, to me, I know this resonates very personally and with what we do at Loeb Leadership and what we talk with our clients about is it's the culture. Like it's not just how much is it costing from a bottom line and a dollar perspective, but what culture and environment are you creating for your team member to be able to show up and be present when they're dealing with something difficult and be transparent and vulnerable about, hey, I experienced this loss or I experienced this death. So I know from a leadership perspective, like leaders like to see, what is that dollar number it's costing? But I know you and I have also talked about it's more than just dollars. It's also about the people perspective.
Sure.
So, which I know we'll get into a
Absolutely.
little bit more.
Absolutely. I'll go ahead and keep moving forward, but at the end, if we could share maybe some of those numbers, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
So when we get back into the prevalence, excuse me,
Oh, sorry. I was going to say for
prevalence,
apologies. It's cutting and it's a little glitchy, but as I say, for our audience, once you get those numbers, feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A and share those with us so we can see some of those and then speak to those as you get that loaded.
that'd be a great idea. So specifically, as we mentioned, how does grief affect business? And as leaders, we absolutely want to support the emotional well-being of every one of our employees. But we know that if we stay only on the heart side, then the work doesn't get done. And if we stay only on the head side, then the emotional well-being isn't met. But when we look at how grief affects business, you can see the prevalence is high. When you look at your organization and think through 25% on an annual basis are experiencing some sort of grief. Now, again, it's not always the death of a loved one. It could be a divorce. It could be a partner experiencing a financial loss or a loss of job, but 25% are experiencing some sort of personal life disruption in their lives that will affect their ability to be present in the workplace. And I also want to point out how grief affects retention. There was a significant amount of quantitative research and qualitative research that we were privy to that specifically focused on when someone comes back to work after a grief event and they are not acknowledged, the propensity for them to leave the organization almost 60%. And let me just share a personal example that will help articulate this. One of our prospects had an employee, 55 years old, and she came back to work after her mom died. Literally, she had 5 days bereavement and she was back the next week, still dealing with a lot of the business of death, where in terms of estate planning and getting rid of possessions and all those kind of things that accompanies the death of a loved one. But her boss walked around the perimeter of the office space so he wouldn't have to make eye contact with her. He was afraid that he would cry, she would cry, it would be awkward, the elephant would be in the room, and no one would know what to do or say. Well, the reality of that particular situation is about 6 months later, she left the organization. She left the organization because she felt alienated and truly not cared for by her team. So again, we look at the downstream effects of grief in the workplace and an absenteeism. Obviously, you know the numbers as leaders, billions of dollars annually. And then we look at presenteeism. And again, a little bit newer concept, if you will, but the fact that people are sitting in their desk and they're perfectly fine physically, but they're not there emotionally, that downstream effect truly affects their ability to be productive in the workplace. And at this point, too, we ask you to think about your own workplace and to think about, particularly, if there's been any significant amount of absenteeism, or have people taken bereavement or FMLA for caregiving. We've got a couple of clients where the team members have passed away. And specifically, how do we support the team that's back in the office after their beloved associate has passed away? And it's important for leaders to think through how grief affects the teams.
Yeah.
When I talk about, go ahead, Tamara.
Oh, sorry. One thing I know you can't see me, Lisa, because the PowerPoint deck. So, one thing that came up from one of our audience members shared, we said this out loud at one of our meetings. You don't know what folks are going through, and I know that's so true and reigns home for me. And I've actually talked with, I can think of at least 2 or 3 clients who I've connected with on a personal level. I lost my brother in 2022. He was killed in a car accident when he was 25 years old, and I've connected with 2 clients who have also lost siblings. And what this audience member shared about you don't know what folks are going through is 100% accurate. And honestly, too, when cultures and companies and leaderships don't create the space for people to share that, that's where you said that woman who left after 6 months because she was avoided by people not being able to have those conversations or create that safe psychological safety for people to share, hey, I lost my brother, or hey, I'm going through this experience. That's where I think that presenteeism and absenteeism also ties into, we don't know what people are going through. And grief, as we all know, for people who have experienced it, it's not linear. There's no way to know when grief is going to pop up, when it's going to occur. It's not just the 3 days after where bereavement leave is given that you're going through grief. People grieve for the rest of their lives when they lose somebody. So what I found when working with employers and working with clients is oftentimes they're like, oh yeah, we have bereavement leave in place. We have an EAP in place. They have these more tactical things of they're like, oh yes, we have that to support the employee. But that's, grief isn't just after the event. Grief is for a lifetime. And people want to be in a place and an environment where they're comfortable to talk about what they're experiencing as it comes up, which I think it ties directly into this presenteeism. If somebody can't say, it's my brother's birthday this week and I'm going to take an extra day off, or I may be I may be acting or showing up differently this week because it's my brother's birthday. That all ties into how they can show up in the workplace and where they feel safe and supported.
Thank you for sharing that, Tamara. And it brings me to everything you've just described is the empathetic leadership development that Loeb and workplace healing basically focus on. And it's empathetic leadership development. It's so key, and recognizing those people where they are. Your personal story regarding your brother, and whether it's his birthday, the anniversary of his passing, those are all triggers for presenteeism. And it's important for leaders and managers and supervisors to understand that, particularly for Tamara, that's going to be a trigger for her. And I've listed here, you'll see the 4 purple bubbles, the triggers for people for presenteeism and grievers have the highest risk are holidays and different other disruptions that might occur in their lives, different seasons. We have a lot of examples, frankly, where a employee has lost a child or they've had a miscarriage. Well, when kindergarten roundup comes around, those folks are experiencing a tremendous amount of presenteeism, or high school graduations, other life events where you wish your loved one would have been there. Even with the loss of a parent, if a high school graduation's coming around and typically that grandmother would have been sitting in the audience, that's a trigger for presenteeism. And it's important for managers to understand that. Just the other day, I heard an interesting analogy that I'd like to share. And Tamara, you may know the specific phrase this is called, but it was called the grief ball in a box. And it talked about, or the woman was explaining how right after a grief event occurs, and again, it could be a divorce, it could be any sort of personal life disruption, that ball is really big inside this box. But there's almost as if there's a trigger on the top. And when the ball is big and grief is very recent, it's very easy for that ball to hit the top of the box. Well, over time, the ball does shrink. It never goes away, just as Tamara Fox just articulated. It never goes away. But different triggers make that ball hit that trigger again. And that could be Christmas music in the office. It could be Mother's Day, Father's Day, anything that comes around that again triggers an event for that employee. Managers and supervisors need to be aware. And they need to be aware in terms of how their employee's brain is acting as far as grief goes. Tamara, did you have anything to add before I move on?
And no, thank you, Lisa. I love that analogy you just shared about the ball because I've heard grief. Grief is often referred to as like a ball. It's something we carry and it's something we hold. And I've also heard a similar analogy and read on a similar analogy that it takes actually 6 years for us to fully process a death. So I mentioned my brother's passing was in 2022. I'm a year and a half out. I'm not even at the full place yet where they say that I've actually fully processed his death and his loss. And I think that's oftentimes something I see too when working with organizations and talking with leaders is they'll say, oh yeah, well that person experienced a loss a year ago. I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to do for them now. And it's not a matter of a manager and leader having to have the answers. It's a matter of having to have conversations and being trained in a way that you can create the space and ask the right question that your employee will open up and share what's going on. Share with you that, hey, this anniversary is coming up, or I'm triggered by Christmas music. I'm triggered by Mother's Day, and here's why. So it's not that the manager has to have the answer. It's the manager has to be trained. And knowing that, the first 6 years will be the hardest for an employee after they've experienced a tragic life event like grief, as that ball continues to get smaller. Because what I've heard again with that ball analogy is we have that ball of grief that we carry, and each year we grow layers around it that change our life and our new reality that we're now living in. So allowing somebody to say, okay, that first year is the most difficult. So it's the first birthday without them. It's the first holiday without them. It's the first, all these firsts. And then from there, it's a different challenge in that second year. So those first 6 years are the most difficult. And I think managers and leaders being trained on that and knowing that they can say, okay, I know that past 6 years, it's still difficult for them and they're still learning and there's still challenges that come up and there's still triggers for that person. But in those first 6 years, you can hold more empathy. You can create more of a safe space. You can create more dialogue. You can ask them, do you want me to ask you about your loved one? Would you like me to check in with you around holidays? Can you let me know times that I should be more present and more available for you so that the manager can pay attention to that and they can ask questions again and have the employee articulate what they need? I've sometimes said with employers, it's sometimes in a similar way in like the ADA process for those HR attendees we have on the call. And the ADA process is an interactive conversation. I know that's legal and you follow a very strict and specific way. But I think a frame it's similar to an interactive process of you have the employee tell you what do they need, when do they need it, how do they need support, and what works best for them, because grief does not affect all of us in the same way and we all have different needs.
Exactly. So well said. And, one of the things, a couple things. Number one, we never want to ask a leader or a manager to be a therapist. We only want to raise the bar, if you will, on grief awareness in the workplace. And obviously, letting that manager know that, for example, even with these examples of 6 symptoms, if you will, of a brain on grief, just bringing awareness that when someone comes back to work after bereavement, it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while, and they're never really normal again. One of the things, Tamara, you mentioned the 6 years in our software platform as we're educating managers on building a plan for someone when they come back after bereavement. We tell managers some of our research has been the highest levels of presenteeism are 6 to 18 months. And specifically on that 18-month presenteeism, very high level, it's with loss of a spouse or loss of a child. And there's kind of a, again, where the highest propensity for presenteeism is also in that time linear fashion as well. You're also going to find employees who, as you can see, maybe might be working too much. There are definitely differences between how men and women grieve. There's no doubt about it. And as a leader, sometimes our job is just to listen. I've had a lot of employees and employers say, well, I'm a private griever. In that case, we just need to listen as leaders and be available, and also take note of perhaps when they are working too much, or if they're at the office for 16 hours a day and then getting back in at 5 a.m. every morning. That's also a symptom of presenteeism. And it doesn't always look like it, but the downstream effect could be a productivity loss. We also find that there's a expression called regarding purpose, regarding a new purpose when someone comes back. And how, again, do we support people when they come back with renewed purpose and they're experiencing presenteeism? So I ask you to consider, and it's an important note that we can't eliminate presenteeism. We can only be empathetic as a leader and empathetic as a manager or a supervisor, but being aware is always the first step. At Workplace Healing, we created a conversation acronym that we call the ABLE conversation. And Tamara, I invite you to jump in as I give different examples here. But with the ABLE conversation, it stands for ask, believe, listen, and encourage. So let me give you a few examples. I'm the HR CHRO at an organization, and one of my employees has let me know that their spouse has passed away. I'm going to think through an ABLE conversation and actually try to listen more than talk. Because as humans and as leaders, we want to solve things for our employees. We want to try to pepper them with solutions. But instead, it's important that we take a step back and just listen, ask, and believe. So, an example would be on ask. Instead of saying to your employee, "How are you?" it's better to say, "How are you this morning, today? And what can the team take off your plate today?" Because as grievers, it's really one day at a time. And in some situations, it's 1 hour at a time. So when we ask, we don't want to ask too generally. We want to be specific in our ask.
Mhm.
Another thing is when we talk to them and we ask, it's one of a lot of managers and leaders have said, "Well, I told my employee to take as long as you need." Well, that actually made that griever or that caregiver feel completely overwhelmed. Because when someone said, "Take as long as you need," they didn't know if that meant 2 days, 2 months, or 6 months. So there was so much confusion. And then they think about PTO and FMLA and how that's all going to work. So it's not the best thing, obviously, to say, "Take as long as you need," but rather to say, "How much capacity do you have for work this week?" Again, taking things down to a kind of a granular level. Did you have anything else on that, Tamara, before I move on to B?
No, I love those examples that you gave, Lisa. And oftentimes I found when working with leaders or providing trainings on this topic and having conversations on this topic, oftentimes most leaders and managers go, when somebody says, "Hey, I experienced a loss or a death, or I'm going through this," the manager's initial first reaction is, "Okay, well, we have an EAP, or talk to it." Like they typically kind of shut down and say, "Talk to HR," because managers and leaders typically aren't comfortable engaging in these conversations. They don't know what to do or say. So when they do that, by doing that, they're telling the employee, non-verbally telling the employee, "I don't want you to talk to me about this topic. This is something you talk to HR about." So by them engaging in the questions that you just said, what do you have capacity for today? What can we take off your plate today? What do you need from me today as your leader? Or how can I help you today? How can I make today? How can I help you get through today? What does that look like? Just engaging in them in a way that allows them to show, "I'm here as your manager to support you." Yes, HR is there to provide other resources and support and guide you through that, but also establishing the manager establishing their presence and support as the manager creates a whole different conversation, because I typically don't see managers willing to engage in that vulnerability. They typically say, "Hey, why don't you talk to HR and see what resources you have? And I'm so sorry for your loss."
Mhm. It's a great point. And also, we found too, a lot of managers will say, "Well, here's our employee assistance plan." And typically it's 3, 4, 5 therapy sessions. And as a manager, we're going on with our days, we're going on with our weeks, we're going on with our business plans, and we're just assuming that person's getting better. And that assumption that someone else is going to handle it, whether it's your EAP or HR department, is often what can get you into trouble as a leader. So, able conversation, ask, and then B stands for believe. And that is, we need to believe and listen without judgment, because sometimes a griever might say, I haven't slept in 4 nights, or I haven't eaten in 4 days, or I've only eaten donuts for the last 4 days. Grievers will not have a normal, quote, 8 hours of sleep and a perfectly healthy Mediterranean diet, because they're going through so many things on so many levels. So, as a manager, when you hear that, you might think, okay, we're going to put together a meal plan for our employees, so we can do a meal sign up or a gift card from a grocery store. So thinking through, just listening what that employee might need. And again, it fosters culture, it fosters team support, it fosters so much empathy in the workplace. And we know that, as you can see on the slide, 92% of employees say they're going to stay with an empathetic employer. And it's so key. So ask, believe, listen. I touched on pretty easy. We just need to stop and listen and pause and know that even though we want to solve things for our employee, even though we want to help and do as much as we can, we have to stop peppering them with solutions and just stop and listen. And sometimes, as I mentioned before, a griever might be what is officially called a private griever. And in that case, we just be available to listen. And E stands for encourage. And this gets into what we call post traumatic growth. But encourage specifically means, let's say I come back to work and my parent passed away with a heart condition. Well, then my team might get together and we might go on a 5K to support the American Heart Association on a weekend. Or if a child has a particular sort of cancer, maybe the team gets together and rallies some sort of fundraiser in the office. So, because that griever, when they come back, they're going to seek a new sort of purpose in their life. They're seeking something different, and we need to encourage that as a leader, as an employer. So I mentioned post-traumatic growth. And Tamara, did you have another point to add as far as that goes?
No, I'd love for you to share on post traumatic growth, and I'm sure I'll have more to add in, but would love for you to get started on this.
Okay, here's a great example of this one. When we discovered post-traumatic growth, there was actually a professor from the University of North Carolina, Richard Tedeschi, and he coined the term, I think back in the 90s. But specifically, what he was talking about is when someone experiences a personal life disruption, in particular a grief event, they often seek new purpose, as I mentioned, that they often seek a new way to grow, if you will, to grow in their life. And he coined the term post traumatic growth. And as employers and as leaders, it's important to recognize that your grievers will be seeking this on some level. It could be as simple as maybe they're going to take time out to go to a grief support group, or they're going to take time out of their day to journal. But it also could mean they want to give back in some way. So, just a personal example, a friend of mine, his wife, 48 years old, died of brain cancer. He works at a big accounting firm in the United States, and his supervisor, his boss, said, "I know that you're the type that wants to somehow give back." So now this employee is on 2 boards. Be Headstrong, Head for the Cure, supporting brain cancer research, supporting brain cancer patients and caregivers. And his employer said to him, if you need to take time out through the week, once or twice a month, or a few hours a week to be on these boards, to sit on these boards, we want you to do so, because you're a valued employee. You've been at the company for years and we don't want to lose you. And they know that he's changed and that he's going to give back in some way after this traumatic experience that he experienced with his wife. So that is a great example of post-traumatic growth. I'll also share Mindy Corcoran, the co-founder of Workplace Healing. Personally, she experienced a horrific tragedy here in Kansas City when her son and father were murdered by a white supremacist in Overland Park, Kansas in 2014. Mindy started a foundation. We co-founded Workplace Healing. She wrote a book. I wrote a book after my mother passed away. These are examples of post-traumatic growth. And it's important as a leader, as an employee, to recognize that your employees want to do something like that. There's just so many different levels. They don't have to start a foundation, but they might want to be on a committee in their local county or their local city. So presenteeism support is what you can do as managers and leaders and C-suite to help your employees feel supported by your teams. We know that fostering that re-engagement and encouraging grievers to talk to each other is so important to have them feel supported by their teams and know that they work for an empathetic employer. I'll add there's been a lot of research done on grief mentorship and grieving in community. And how does that relate to the workplace? Well, an example here in Kansas City, we have a company where they had, it's a large construction company, and they had several of their employees experience personal grief events in their lives. And honestly, a couple guys got together and started just this lunch and several years ago. And then the group has grown, and they just, once a month, they just talk. Another client here in town has a caregiving group, and they're caregivers for whether it's children or parents. And it's just a very informal group. But what the company has found is that it helps basically decrease presenteeism because it makes them feel present in the workplace when they've got a group to share with. And they don't have to do it after 5 o'clock or on a Saturday or on a Sunday. So that in a nutshell is post-traumatic growth. And as leaders, it's so important for you to foster that and to even recommend something in your workplace that might help that person feel supported by their team.
And Lisa,
Tamara, anything else?
Yeah, no, I love that. And one thing that I've seen done too is managers giving employees. I was going to actually tie back to the able conversation. It was a point that came up while you were sharing. And oftentimes I'll see managers when an employee shares something, traumatic is going on or they're experiencing a death. Unintentionally, a manager will kind of flip the conversation about themselves and say, "Oh, I experienced that too, and here's what I did," and try to like guide the employee through like how to heal, how to grieve, how to support, instead of these what we've been talking about. And here you just said it in the post-traumatic growth, giving them the space to find what they want, that they need for their own grief, for their own healing, for their own post-traumatic growth. So I'd say for those on the call or our audience listening is you can definitely give suggestions and guide your employees if is there would you like to sit on a board? Or I've those examples Lisa just shared, I've seen others do this in their grief. Is there anything we can do as an organization? Or is there anything I can do as your leader to create that space for you to do that? And how can I support you in that process for saying, here's what you should do? I know that sometimes it's unintentional and we have the best intent in mind. We always have positive intent, but we try to kind of shepherd people into a direction where with grief, we really want to allow them to explore what they need while maybe giving suggestions and things that have worked for others, but allowing them to kind of pick their own way and pave their own path.
That's a great summary. And it takes, a lot of the HR departments that I know Tamara has worked with and that I've worked with too. Typically, they just do flowers and cards, and that's always a simple gesture, and it's an important gesture. There's no minimization of that gesture. But if we can take it a step further and recognize that that employee is going to be seeking some other sort of post-traumatic growth, if you will, it's important for you to understand. And I'll also add, and Tamara brought this up earlier in our conversation, it's important for leaders to know that when an employee does experience, whether it's a caregiving event, whether it's a death of a loved one, it's important for that leader to make note of, again, the anniversary and what might be coming around. And for example, with the brain cancer example with my friend, he said, it would have made all the difference in the world to him if his accounting firm said, "Gosh, I know that," and it was January 29th the next year, "I know this is going to be a tough day for you. Maybe you don't need to fly to New York that day." So it's important, again, just to as a leader, just take a step back and consider growth, consider the triggers that we talked about, and consider how we can focus on presenteeism and literally just be aware of what that person's going through from an empathy perspective. So with our company, we called our solution the Human Recovery Platform. And I won't go through all the details of the tactics, but we specifically have nearly 150 tactics on how leaders can select the balance of head and heart. Because we found again that companies always have or typically have great head-based solutions. They've got employee assistance plans. They've got life insurance. They've got financial planning. They've got perhaps legal assistance when someone loses a spouse or loses a family member. And we call those head-based policies. And they're needed. And you've got to have them. But they can't be the only thing. You've got to balance that with empathetic solutions. And as Tamara and I both articulated today, empathetic solutions could be as simple as flowers and cards, but also acknowledging post traumatic growth, acknowledging renewed purpose, acknowledging a holiday, the anniversary of a loved one, acknowledging that your griever is certainly not 100% present when they're back in the workplace. So the heart-based solutions, you can't be all heart because I mentioned before, then the work doesn't get done. So we've got to find a balance of head and heart in the workplace. And specifically, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just gonna bring up a question. It ties exactly to what you were sharing, Lisa, with the head and heart. And we have a question from our audience, but it's also too and I know your software platform takes your users through this and it's phenomenal, but it's more than just, flowers or cards. It's what does that person need? When you and I were looking at the platform together, some people have a specific religion that they're associated with, and it shows in there. How do you help that person with that specific religion? What do they need? They may need different time off to honor that death than just that 3 days.
Exactly.
So what it looked like.
Thank you for bringing that up because we never want to have the manager or the leader think they have to be an expert on world religion. So what we've done is in one of our categories, there's a link to what we call a Heart Hub resource. So let's give an example. I'm a leader and I know my employees coming back. They only have 5 days bereavement. And this is actually a real story. And there was a woman in the organization and her mom died. And she had to fly to India with her mother's body because of her personal religion. Well, as a corporate leader, the corporate leader didn't even understand what that might entail, what the expectations of her life might be, what the expectations of her employer might be. So we have what we call a Heart Hub resource that you just click on. And specifically, that is a quick 3-paragraph summary on what an employer can expect when their employee has a different tradition or a different funeral tradition or a different religious tradition than what they're accustomed to. So thank you, Tamara, for bringing that up because we never want to ask a leader to be an expert on therapy or world religion. We only want to provide those resources so that at your fingertips, specifically what they might be going through.
Yeah, and training them so that they know when does their role end and when does their role begin as a leader or manager. We had a question come through from the audience member. What do you do when you've helped someone going through a loss and now their performance has declined? I think initially for me, I'll chime in to answer that, and Lisa would love you to weigh in, is when I've historically worked with organizations or managers where somebody's performance has declined due to grief or due to any other traumatic event, the biggest cause that I have seen when working is it's because the manager didn't create the space up front for the employee to articulate that they needed help. So the employee kept just chugging along, doing the best they could while working. And I know Lisa talked about this earlier, where maybe they were working too hard, but they had foggy brain. So they weren't even able to complete their normal tasks or regular tasks. And their manager wasn't fully present to acknowledge, hey, or created the space to have the conversations with that employee, those able conversations, to allow the employee to say, I feel like I'm working too hard, but my performance is not great. So what I have found is the manager's intervention was a little too late. It was a more reactive approach instead of a proactive approach. So in order to help somebody who their performance has declined, one, ideally the manager is more proactive than reactive. And then two, it's the manager creating that space to have those able conversations Lisa talked about before. So if you don't go the proactive approach and now you have to be reactive because their performance has already declined, I understand that HR may have processes you have to take to document things, but start to have those able conversations, articulate to them, say, be honest. Don't be don't be scared to say that elephant in the room of, um, I I know that you experienced a death. I know that you've been going through something traumatic, and I've seen it impacting your work. What can I do to help you? What do you need from me as your manager to make you feel that you can be more productive and you're more supported in this work environment? Be honest with them and have that vulnerable conversation. I would say to start first if you have to be reactive, and then see what the employee needs. And I understand HR may have to take different precautions if from there it doesn't improve. But by starting and addressing the truth of, you know, that they're going through something difficult and you want to truly support them through that, and asking them what that looks like is a great place to start. But Lisa, other thoughts?
Oh, that was beautiful. I think the key is what you said about being proactive versus reactive. And that's being proactive up front. And that is the key, and not being fearful about talking about a situation, and better understanding and being empathetic about what they're going through. So proactive versus reactive. Thank you.
Yeah. And I've found too, when working and talking with people who have experienced grief, they've told me that they've seen people just carry on like the day is normal and act like everything's fine. And when there is a manager or leader who shows up and says, "How are you really?" Or, "I can tell you're not okay today. Is there anything I can do to help?" That is what makes the biggest impact and difference for people in a workplace, when somebody's truly present. So for that example, if their performance has declined, it's just being honest and vulnerable with them and showing up for them in a way that they may need.
Mhm. Good. Well said. Any other questions from the audience coming through?
That looks like our last one for now, but we may get a few more in our next 15 minutes here as we wrap up. Oh, wait, somebody just did say, I have a colleague who lost two daughters in a tragic fire. He told me that what he needs is for others to share their strength with them. I love that, of just others showing support too. Like for me, when I can say personally, when I mentioned I lost my brother last year, he was 25 years old, so he was really young. So just when people would say and reach out, "I'm here for you." And the little things sometimes are what people need the most when going through grief. I know for me personally, like, I didn't want flowers. I didn't want people sending me things, because it was a reminder that my brother was gone. But when I was on a call with a
Mhm.
colleague, if they were saying, "Hey, I can just tell you," or if I had the comfortability to say to them, "I'm not having a great day today. I can't take this call. Can somebody else take it for me?" Those for me were the biggest places of support from colleagues and managers that I needed, that they had my back. They could show up for me in my work. They were supporting me through the process. They were giving me somewhat strength in different ways as I was navigating something very, very difficult. And they did it for months. It wasn't just like the first week or two that they did that. I could say it 6 months down the road of, "Hey, I'm not having a great day today. I'm thinking about my brother a lot," or this memory popped up, a picture. With social media these days too, we're reminded so much of people we've lost more than we ever have been. So I know for me personally, I have memories pop up on social media, or my phone just shows me featured photos on the iPhone in the corner every day, which is great, but it's also a reminder. So we can have little tiny triggers that we're not expecting happen, that are not sometimes those big events like a holiday or a birthday, and that remind us of someone we've lost. So being supportive, um, showing kindness, showing empathy. And I think for me, it's when people create that safe space and actually let you talk when you're experiencing death or experiencing a loss. That's the biggest thing. Sometimes people just want a place to talk. And I'm not a private. I know you shared earlier, there's private grievers. I'm not a private griever. I'm very public. I've talked about my losses publicly, but sometimes you just want people to listen.
Mhm. And I'm glad you brought that up too with your personal stories, because sometimes as a leader or as a manager, we're very scared. Let's say someone's spouse passed away. We're very scared as leaders to bring up what we might be doing this weekend with our spouses. Okay. And so oftentimes, though, the griever, it's as if they want the rest of the team to be able to talk about their family. I know in Mindy Corcoran, my co-founder's personal situation, after her son Reed passed away and she was back at lunch with her coworkers, with her team, she finally had to tell the team, I give you permission to talk about your family, because nobody knew what to say. And literally, they were just nearly sitting in silence at a lunch. So one of the things we and talk to the leaders about, we even give them conversation tips to talk about, whether it's the sports team or New York Yankees or whatever city you're in Denver, Kansas City, just to give leaders tips on some other things to bring up. So there's not just this weighted silence of the elephant in the room. And I will say, in my work with grievers, when someone talks about a loss of a loved one, they typically, especially after that bubble, as Tamara described, kind of goes down. I mean, you smile when you think of neat experiences or great family adventures. Perhaps there's a smile that comes into your heart. And I think that as leaders, we tiptoe around maybe that person's name. We're not going to remind that person that they lost their husband or their mother or their father or their dog. We're not going to remind them. They already know. So it's okay to share stories together. And I think that's an important one to acknowledge as well.
And one thing I've taught a lot of people to do is to ask the griever, would you like me to ask you about? So my brother's name was Isaac. So for me, do you want me to ask you about Isaac? Do you want me would you like to share stories with me about Isaac? It's asking the griever what they want, because for a lot of grievers, and I know it doesn't apply to all, but they want to talk about the person they lost. They want to share stories. They want to say, hey, this picture of Isaac popped up on my phone today. I'd love to send it to you in our Teams chat or our Slack channel. So asking the griever, would you like to continue to talk about this person? Would you like me to ask you about them? Would you like to share memories with me? Asking them again what they need, because we oftentimes grievers want to keep their memory alive. And when colleagues give them the space to keep their memory alive and want to share in that memory with them, it creates that empathetic culture that you spoke to.
And here's another example. We had a client where her husband passed away, and she basically told her supervisor, and like you, Tamara, and me as well, I don't need a lot of flowers on my cubicle when I come back to the office next week. I don't need a lot of flowers. I don't need a lot of sympathy cards. But what I would be touched by, she told her boss, is pictures from the last holiday party we had at work. And because in those pictures of the holiday party, there were some really beautiful pictures of she and her husband. And that's what she was grateful for, that people had taken pictures. And a few months later, when they had the holiday party, they were kind enough and empathetic enough to give those pictures to her and put them in her cubicle, because to her, that was far more important than flowers. So another important note on how people's needs are different, and it's important for leaders to understand and ask. So workplace healing these are our vision, mission, and positioning statement. Again, very in line with what Loeb Leadership is doing in terms of educating leaders about how to have an empathetic balance of head and heart, get the work done, and still support the emotional well-being of employees. And this is how to get in touch with Workplace Healing, specifically our website. I'll add on our website, there's some great articles and resources. We just had one launched yesterday about pet bereavement. And it's important to note as leaders, and it's important to note as rise of Gen Z and millennials in the workplace, their grandparents may still be alive. They perhaps never had a grief event, but their family dog passed away, and it affects their ability to be productive in the workplace. So we just had an article launched this week on pet loss. That would be insightful. And you'll see a whole array of articles and resources, again, on how to manage your griever. Obviously, our LinkedIn. And of course, I would love to connect with you, same with Tamara, about how we can educate your leaders about supporting grievers in the workplace. And I will say at Workplace Healing, we have three levels of offerings, if you will. We have the software platform that we just touched on briefly today, the Human Recovery Platform, which is a 24/7 software tool that employers have access to, that managers have access to. And we also offer this sort of leadership training via personal, in person, or virtual. Again, to basically support the software platform, and they work in tandem on how we can support those grievers. And of course, early on, I mentioned the grief forecast to really, for you to take a look at the propensity of productivity loss in your workplace. So with that, I'll quit sharing my screen, Tamara, if you want to take over from your end.
Yeah. So we did have one more audience member drop in a comment in the chat that they also think employers who have bereavement leave with strict parameters, i.e. only like immediate family, not a brother-in-law. It's as it's hard to define the closeness or connection to the employee or someone within the family, regardless of the media or not, even including pets. So I think that's one thing to consider and think about, especially for those leaders or HR team members on the call who have the ability to drive some change in your programs and policies, is to consider some flexibility when it comes to things like bereavement leave. I know I worked with employers in the past that have a very strict bereavement leave policy. It's like 1 day for, sibling, mother, father, child, and it doesn't even include grandparents. And the reality is grief impacts everyone differently. And to have those strict parameters and not have flexibility around how you can support people is what doesn't support all of the things Lisa and I just talked about. It doesn't create a space where you have an empathetic culture. It doesn't create a space where managers can have true conversations to allow employees that what they're sharing. So for those that do have control in those policies and programs that you design, think about that too. Think about it. I know we work with employers and leaders at Loeb Leadership to define more of a strategic approach with that training, with tools like Workplace Healing's platform, with solutions to make it more of that human touch aspect and not just here's your policy, here's your EAP, let us know what you need. So I do want to wrap up here. I try to always close these out a couple minutes early, and most people have calls. But Lisa, thank you so much. I know I always thoroughly enjoy my time chatting with you and could talk with you for hours about this topic that is very close to home for me. Thank you for our audience again for joining us. We welcome questions at any time. Don't hesitate to reach out to me or Lisa. We'd love to connect and explore this further, whether within your organization or if you have personal questions as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. And thank you, Loeb Leadership, for the opportunity today. It was a pleasure.